Hello everyone and welcome to the shop. Today we're making an epoxy river sit-stand desk out of maple wood and dark ube epoxy. This is my first epoxy project and first video, and it began in the old cramped shop before I ever hit record, with a couple of off-camera preliminaries I performed before I decided to try my hand at woodworking videos. But more on that in a sec. For now, let's talk about lumber. For the lumber for this project, I bought two 6-foot rustic maple live edge timberlink slabs from Woodcraft. As you can see here, Woodcraft intends these pieces to be used in conjunction with a maple centerpiece to construct a custom width live edge slab. And because of this, they've included these pocket holes here, which you can use in combination with screws and center planks to create custom width tables like this one, and custom width headboards like this one. In our project, though, our centerpiece is going to be an epoxy river poured over the live edge side, rather than attached to the square side. And because of this, these pocket holes will not be necessary. So we've gone ahead and filled them in with this purple or dark ube epoxy. This is some of the preliminary work that I did off camera. I also removed the bark and cleaned the softwood off of these live edges off screen. With the off-camera preliminaries out of the way, I'm now going to prep the live edges for their first contact with epoxy, and I'll do so by sanding the edges with 80 grit using a random orbital sander. Any epoxy that you work with comes in two parts, the resin and the hardener. And we're going to go ahead and mix these two together to make a tabletop epoxy that we can use to seal our live edges. We'll start by combining the two parts together and stirring them with a painter stick until we're confident that the parts have been mixed thoroughly. We're now going to seal the live edges with tabletop epoxy. This is so that the pigment from the epoxy river doesn't stain the wood, and so that bubbles don't make it from the wood into the epoxy river. For similar reasons, we're also going to seal the remainder of the surfaces with the water-based polyurethane. Now it's time to construct the mold for the river table using this big sheet of melamine. Here I'm cutting the floor of the mold to size while keeping 2.5-inch wide pieces from these cuts that I can use as walls for the mold. For this, I'm using a Bora straight edge as well as a skill saw with a 40-tooth blade. Here's the mold floor, and here I am cutting the mold walls to size. I'm making the mold out of melamine because it is very flat and because in theory epoxy doesn't stick to it, but in practice it mostly does. So it's important to add a layer of protection in the form of this red tuck tape here, which I've added to the walls and am now shirtlessly adding to the floor. Woodworkers will often use either tuck tape or a mold release spray to protect their tables from melamine. But I'm overly cautious, and so I'll use both the tuck tape and the mold release spray. Before I spray, though, I'll need to assemble the mold, which I'm doing here by adding a bead of caulk to the underside of the walls, before clamping them into place, and drilling screws into pre-drilled holes. To ensure the walls are fixed at a 90-degree angle, I'm using these carpenter square clamps, as well as your standard pipe clamps fixed at regular intervals to ensure that there are no gaps in pressure. There's gotta be a better way to drill these screws into the underside, but here we are. Once everything was drilled into place, I removed the clamps and applied another bead of the silicone caulk to every seam of the mold, and this is an important step in avoiding leaks. I then moved to the side yard, far away from all of my lumber, to apply the mold release spray. I applied about 3 layers, giving a thorough wipe in between each layer. In combination with the tuck tape, this should ensure that no epoxy will stick to the mold. We're now going to prep for the epoxy pour itself, and we'll start by putting the wood into place. This mold was made slightly larger than the table itself will be, and there's roughly 1/4 of an inch of space in between the wood and the walls on each side. We're then going to clamp the wood into place using these wooden clamp assists. We're fixing them at regular intervals again to avoid gaps in pressure. This is ultimately so that the wood doesn't float when we pour the epoxy. We're then going to make a small dam using caulk so that the epoxy stays relatively where we want it to be. Now it's time to begin the pour. We're going to be using Liquid Glass 2.0 Deep Pour Epoxy and Dark Ube Mica Powder Pigment. This is what it looks like when we combine the two together. We do want to make sure we get a thorough mix. I spent about 5 or 6 minutes doing this before we pour. And let's do a moment of silence for this beautiful pour. Once the epoxy is poured, I'll use this cooking torch to pop the bubbles near the surface. After about a week, everything is finally cured, and the curing process left this cool thermal pattern below the surface. Now it's time to get the river table out of the mold. While the pipe clamps came off relatively easily, these wooden clamp assists became adhered to the surface due to the epoxy that we poured. So I had to go through this relatively satisfying removal process using a hammer. This worked for all but one of the clamp assists, which we'll have to saw off in the future. The last view of the table in the mold, and here I'm beginning to remove the table from the mold. First I'll place it upside down on a padded sheet. I'll then hammer the underside to get the epoxy loose from the mold itself. After the epoxy's loose, I'll remove the mold from the table, and we'll get our first glimpse at the underside of the river table. Here we're looking at it with Lindsay. Speaking of Lindsay, we bought a new house at this point in the process and have a new shop. Let's take a look inside. Remember when I said that the mold was about 1/4 of an inch larger than the table on each side? Well, the epoxy filled that space. And so the first step we're going to take after removing the table from the mold is to remove the excess epoxy from the table. For this, we're using a Bora straight edge with a new attachment that turns my circular saw into a track saw. We're also using a standard Japanese pole saw. And now that the table's out of the mold, I can remove that last stubborn clamp assist. Normally at this point in the process, I would pass the table through a planer in order to flatten and level the top surface, or otherwise use a CNC machine for flattening and leveling. However, a CNC machine feels like cheating, and this table is nearly 3 feet wide. I don't have access to a planer large enough to pass the table through it. So I'm going to have to make a router sled that I can use to flatten and level the top surface. I'll start by cutting 4 strips of melamine down to size and drilling pocket holes into 2 out of the 4 strips. This is a quick note to Woodcraft. Your customers are able to put pocket holes into their lumber if they would like to, and this may be preferable to including them in your stock lumber. Here I'm assembling the 2 sides of the router sled, clamping the walls at a 90-degree angle from the floor before screwing them into place with pocket screws. I'll then attach the 2 sides together using my router base for an exact distance. I've seen quite a few folks on YouTube measure the router base and sled with measuring tape to determine the right distance between the 2 sides, but I found this method both easier and more exact. In the sled, the router moves on this axis here, and the sled moves on this axis, allowing for full coverage of the table similar to a CNC. I'm using a straight router bit, which produces a flat surface on the bottom of whatever passes through it. I'm going to use the mold walls as rails for the router sled, and I've added these risers so that the table sits the right height. These walls are an identical height and perfectly parallel, such that they allow for a level router sled. Let's see this thing in action. From the outset, it's nice to see the excess epoxy and caulk removed, and get a glimpse at the wood and epoxy on a flat, level surface that is beginning to look more like the final product. This process took a little over a month, and with 10,000 passes, I now consider myself an expert user of this particular router sled. I've tried to limit the month's worth of footage to under 1 minute here in an effort to be engaging. And here is the fully planed table. Looks like the router sled did a pretty good job at keeping us level on the length, and we're also pretty level on the width, leaving us with a successfully planed top surface. The next step is going to be a flaw removal process. We'll start by removing the router lines, as well as the router burn marks, and we'll do so by moving through a sanding progression with coarse 40, 60, and 80 grit sandpaper. .40 grit sandpaper is one of the coarsest abrasives a hobbyist can get his hands on. 40, 60, and 80 grit are known as your removal grits, and 40 grit did a great job removing the majority of the router lines and burn marks. After the 40 grit, some subtle lines, pocks, and divots were still apparent, which the 60 grit did a great job at removing. Before moving on to 80 grit, I'm going to do what's called water popping. When this water evaporates, it'll raise the grain on the wood and give the results of the sanding a bit more consistency. This 80 grit here should get us pretty close to flat. And after some quick flatness checks, I'll move on to the remainder of the flaw removal process. It's now time to process these pock marks on the top surface. There's a story behind all of these little flaws, including this guy right here. We're just going to sand it down and fill it with clear epoxy, removing the excess so that it isn't visible in the final product. These pock marks on the spalted maple plank also tell a story. What is spalted maple, you ask? I'm going to defer to an expert here.
What kind of maple?
Spalted.
What's spalted mean?
You see that graphic, those dark lines?
Yeah,
That's
I do
actually,
see those dark lines. We see those dark lines? That's spalting?
Yeah, it's a fungus. When the tree falls and moisture begins to seep in, specifically in maple, it gets these cool lines, and if you mill it soon enough, you just get a cool pattern. If you leave it for a couple more months, then it rots away and it's garbage.
Wow.
Thanks, Nick. These graphics and lines are spalting. The black pocks are signs that whoever milled the plank waited for the opportune moment to mill it, just before the wood began to rot from the fungus. The black pock marks are the beginning signs of rot, but are features of spalted maple, not defects. To process these pock marks, we're going to be using CA glue as well as a carbide scraper. The goal of this process is not to remove the pock marks. They're features of spalting and not bugs. Instead, we're going to fill them in with clear CA glue, so that we have one consistent, flat surface free of holes. I'll want to be able to write on paper over these pocks once this is a desk. After filling them in, I'll scrape them to get relatively flush with the wood's surface. I'm now going to sand down the top surface with 100 grit sandpaper so that I can get a good feel for the results of the glue and epoxy fixes. The epoxy fix does look relatively unnoticeable on the unfinished surface, but I want to ensure no visibility in the finished product, so I wiped it down with mineral spirits to get a peek. I can't see the fix. Can you? I'm also pretty satisfied with the fill on these spalted maple pocks. With the detailing finished on the top side, we're now going to flip it to the bottom side and continue the flaw removal process. And we'll begin by looking at these pits on the left-hand side. The pits are the result of a high concentration of pigment, which threw off the resin and hardener ratios and did not allow the resin to harden in these very small areas. When I removed the wet epoxy, the pits were what remained. They only exist on the bottom side because gravity pulling the pigment down is what caused the higher concentration. The inside of these pits are still wet and won't dry thoroughly without removing some of the hard epoxy. Mixing different wet epoxy products together often results in delaminating, so I can't fill the pits as is. So I'll use a drill with a wire wheel to remove any wet bits. This will make gouges in the table that are much bigger than the pits are, but these bigger gouges can easily be filled with epoxy, whereas the wet pits could not. I wasn't sure whether clear or pigmented epoxy would mask these gouges best, so I tried the clear before realizing it looked horrible, and went ahead and mixed in the pigment. Once the epoxy dried, I sanded it down to flush. And I'm now left with a partially sanded bottom surface. So let's go ahead and finish the job and sand down to remove the thin layer of epoxy that is left on the wood, as well as the ridges and valleys left on the epoxy river by the tuck tape that was on the floor of the mold during the curing process. We'll remove the majority of the material here with our 40 grit sandpaper. Before moving on to our 60 and 80 grit, and filling the spalted maple pocks, rounding it out with 100 grit sandpaper. I did the mineral spirits trick again to see the results of the fixes, and this time the fix is visible, but doesn't look too bad and only exists on the bottom side in an area that will be covered by the base. With the bottom side in a good state, let's move on to working on the edge profile. Here, we'll want to round over the top edges with a 1/4 inch roundover bit and put a 30-degree chamfer on the bottom edge. Before we get to that though, I'll need to fix one small detail where the epoxy met the live edge and a bubble formed and cured in place. For this fix, I'll need to get the table upright so that gravity will allow epoxy to sit in the bubble long enough to cure. I'll then add some clear epoxy, as well as some painter's tape so that the clear epoxy doesn't leak onto the top or bottom of the table. This time, I'm going to remove the excess epoxy with a track saw rather than with 40 grit sandpaper or with a router as I did previously. It's now time to round the top edge with a 1/4 inch roundover bit. A rounded edge is more durable than a 90-degree angle and adds a stylistic effect that I appreciate. This did result in some router burn. I'll correct it with 400 grit, which is too fine to remove material in the rounded detail, but will brandish the surface to remove the burn. It looks pretty good, so let's go ahead and continue the process on the remaining 3 top edges. For this, we'll flip it over to the bottom side and add our 30-degree chamfer. A 30-degree router bit would remove too much material at once, so I'm going to begin with a 15-degree router bit to remove about half of the material first. I'll then move on to the 30-degree router bit. I'm going to take care of the router burn this time with a random orbital sander rather than with hand sanding, and this saved me about 3 hours. And here is the rough side profile, which I'm pretty happy with, so let's move on to sanding it to a fine detail. In this step, I move through a sanding progression from 120 grit to 320 grit on each side surface. And here is the finished side profile, which I'm pretty happy with, so let's move on to prepping the base. I did not make any of the components for the sit-stand base, but rather bought an AI terminal dual motor adjustable height desk frame from Amazon. I know I've got a wood shop with plenty of tools to make furniture from raw ingredients, but sometimes those assembly skills learned with IKEA furniture are still required. Once the base is built, I'll place it upside down onto the bottom side of the table to determine placing and alignment. I'll also want to include this StarTech cable management raceway purchased from Amazon. It arrived 6 feet long in muted gray, and I'll process it with a miter saw and black spray paint before placing it on the desk for alignment. And now that everything's in place, I'll mark joining holes with a pencil so that I can place these threaded inserts and avoid gouging the table by attaching the base with screws alone. I know I should use a jig to drill in a straight line perfectly parallel to the surface, but approximately straight is all we really need. I'll now place the threaded inserts using CA glue. It's now time for the final sanding progression before finishing. Here, I'll be moving from 120 grit to 320 grit. Once we get into the 120 range, we go from removal grits to brandishing grits, and anything 220 and above are considered polishing grits. The higher the grit, the more detail is shown in the grain, and the more clarity is shown in the epoxy in the finished product. 4000 grit is ideal for artwork, but can be scratched and damaged by dragging a fingernail across it. For a high-use desk, 320 is a good balance. I also sanded the bottom side to 220 grit off camera. Let's finish this thing. For round 1, we're doing Rubio Monocoat Oil plus 2C. And we're troweling it on before buffing it in and wiping it down. For round 2, we're applying an N3 ceramic nano finish with this applicator. N3 has both a hard coat and a top coat, and we're doing 2 layers of each, starting with the hard coat. The nano finish is hydrophobic, protecting the wood from liquid damage. It also shields against UV light to prevent the epoxy from discoloring over time. Here's the last view of the table in the shop. And here is the final product. I'm really happy with the finished grain on the maple wood, as well as the thermal pattern in the epoxy. And this sit-stand base really brings it all together. Thank you for coming with me on this journey to make the desk a reality. I wish you good luck in all of your maker adventures.